Tonight's lecture will be presented by Lincoln Carr, who's here, who's currently a professor of physics at the Colorado School of Mines. Lincoln obtained his BA in physics from UC Berkeley, his PhD from the University of Washington in Seattle. He was a distinguished international fellow of the National Science Foundation at the École Normale Supérieure, which is in Paris, and an Alexander von Humboldt Fellow at the University of Heidelberg, and he's a fellow of the American Physical Society. So I've known Lincoln since he was a graduate student, working theoretically in an area of quantum physics that I also work on, but experimentally. And this area of physics is an area of ultra-cold atomic physics, which has been the subject of many workshops over the past few years. And it's been a joy to interact with Lincoln on various occasions at these workshops and others in these topics of mutual interest. Lincoln has taught for 25 years, over 25 years, in both sciences and the humanities on topics ranging from quantum physics to revolution. So in case the physics gig doesn't work out, seems unlikely at this point, he's also worked as a theater actor and a dishwasher. So he's a man of many talents. So his talk tonight will be Healing the Sciences Humanities Divide. Please join me in welcoming Lincoln Carr. Here's the mic. Okay.
There's no clip. How's this? Great. It's an honor to be speaking at Aspen. The level of sophistication in this audience is probably far beyond mine on just about everything I'm going to talk about. So I look forward to correcting my misstatements throughout or at the end of the talk. I'm going to present some ideas about how science happens and how we might do it better. As Randy mentioned, I've worked in both sciences and humanities. At the Colorado School of Mines, we have an honors program. And in an honors program, what we do is we try to put together STEM with other ways of thinking in order to solve hard problems outside the box, like clean water, or global climate change, or energy problems across the globe. And so we really think that this honors program is working. Mines feeds a lot of the companies that have vice presidents and CEOs from our university in resource extraction, in the mining industry, of course also in petroleum, but also in physics and chemistry and traditional sciences. And so we try to give students like that another perspective on the world, and we think that makes a real difference in the world. So I want to present for you today where this sort of story comes from for us and how we're trying to change things. Okay, so this is the McBride Honors Program that I'm a part of, and of course the Department of Physics. If you don't know, the School of Mines is right down the road. I just drove 3 hours to come here. Okay, so I'm going to start with a story about whales, and then I will talk about medieval Islamic quandaries and solutions. I'm sure many of you are aware of the dualism and the Enlightenment. I'll talk about frames of reference and how that affects our thinking today. I'll talk about U.S. education, quandaries and solutions, something that I think is very much on our minds right now in terms of our overall political situation and our national situation. And then I'll give you a story about lucid dreaming as a case study in what can be done by listening and paying attention to other fields as scientists. And finally, I'll conclude and read a poem. Okay, so let's talk about sperm whales. So sperm whales are the largest predator on Earth. They're really extraordinary animals. They have the largest brain on Earth, and it's not a featureless brain. It's a wrinkled brain like ours with lots of surfaces and structure in it. They dive up to 2 kilometers. They stay under for up to an hour. They hunt giant squid and fish by echolocation in a large chamber in their head. And they congregate in deep water canyons and along the edge of continental shelves to do their hunting. So we usually don't see them. They're far under. Okay? They're family-oriented. They have a similar life cycle to humans, right? They live about 70 years. They have a long gestation time. They're very close with their young. They have infrequent pregnancies. Basically, these are the large version of us living in the ocean. Okay. All right. So let's talk about what happened in June 16th, 1979 in Oregon, outside of Florence. And what occurred is 41 sperm whales washed up on the shore. And maybe some of you were around for this event. I was actually a small child, and I don't think I recall it, but maybe some of you do. At first people stood around. They didn't know what to do. People don't normally ever see sperm whales, right, because they're deep under the water. To see 41 all at once on the beach, all of them alive, all of them suffering, is a shocking event. So, people wanted to help, right? Greenpeace was very big back then. Maybe they still are, but they were much bigger then. And there were a lot of people in Greenpeace in Oregon. And so Greenpeace volunteers and other volunteers got together, and they did things like tie ropes to the whales and try to, pull them back into the ocean. Okay, this did not work well. You can imagine how absurd this is. 30 people pulling a whale that weighs, tons, right? It simply doesn't work. Okay. So unfortunately, there were not only Greenpeace volunteers, out there and well-meaning citizens, but there were also drunk people dancing on top of the whales and people poking at them, and there's all types, right? When a tragedy strikes, and so they cordoned off the beach, and they allowed really only 4 kinds of people on the beach. They were so worried about people getting injured by these whales. The whales are in the process of dying, and they're moving around, and this goes on for several days, and people are trying to take teeth, right, to sell, and all kinds of things. So, good and bad, worst and best of humanity at the same time. So they cordoned off the beach, and they allowed only police officers, scientists. It happened that there was a marine mammalogy conference right down the road at that time, just by chance. And so, many, many scientists came, okay, to try to get samples, to do something. Right? And they allowed reporters who came in and basically asked everyone, why are they here, why are they here, why are they here, over and over, why are they on the beach? And no one had an answer. And then they allowed the cleanup crew. Okay, so I'm going to read you a short passage from Barry Lopez. Has anyone here read Barry Lopez? A few people in the audience. I think he's one of the great human beings alive right now. I've heard him speak. He's a very extraordinary nature writer, and as a scientist I really relate to him, and as someone who also appreciates and teaches in the humanities, I think he's extraordinary. I use him in all my classes. So this is from his essay on whales from his book, Crossing Open Ground. And I'm going to put quotes like this on the screen so that you can read along with me. The longer quotes will all be up. Mate's 27-year-old graduate student, Jim Harvey, arrived on the beach at dawn on Sunday. At the first sight of the whales, from the top of the dunes, strung out nose to flukes in a line 500 or 600 yards long, the waves of a high tide breaking over them, Harvey simply sat down, awestruck at their size and number. He felt deeply sad, too, but as he drew near, he felt a rush of exhilaration because there was so much information to be gathered. He could not get over the feeling, as he worked, of the size of them. One afternoon, a scientist stood confounded in a whale's abdomen, asking a colleague next to him, "Where's the liver?" Deborah Duffield said of her experience on the beach, "It hurt me more than watching human beings die. I couldn't cope with the pain, the futility. I just turned into myself. It brought out the scientist in me." Another scientist spoke of his hostility toward the sullen crowd, of directing that anger at himself, of becoming cold and going to work. For Harvey and others, there was one incident that broke scientific concentration and brought with it a feeling of impropriety. Several scientists had started to strip blubber from a dead whale. Suddenly, the whale next to it began pounding the beach with its flukes. The flukes is its tail, right? The pounding continued for 15 minutes, lifting and slamming the flukes to the left, lifting and slamming the flukes to the right. When the animal quieted, they resumed work. Scientists rarely get a chance to express their feelings, Harvey said. I was interested in other people's views, and I wanted to share mine, which are biological. I noticed some people who sat quietly for a long time behind the barriers in religious stances. I very much wanted to know their views. So many of the people who came down here were so sympathetic and full of concern, I wished I had the time to talk to them all. Harvey remembered something vividly. On the first day, he put his face near the blowhole of one of the whales, a cylinder of clean, warm, human air at almost a foot in diameter, blew back his hair. Okay, so no novelist, no historian, no moral philosopher, no scholar of Melville, no rabbi, no painter, no theologian had been on the beach, right? And even if they had, been brought there, someone had called them or phoned them in, they couldn't have come past the barricades. In the humanities, we've developed tools to understand this inner world, to understand these intense experiences over thousands of years, from written history of Gilgamesh on, and probably much, much longer than that. In the sciences, we need these tools. We need these tools to deal with tragedy. We need these tools to deal with a lot of things. We can't do science without them. And this was a terrible mistake. And the marine mammalogists after asked themselves how they could have done things better, and there's a lot of writing about it. This was one of the essays. So with that, let me turn now to the origins of science in the medieval world, and particularly in the medieval Islamic world. You may have heard that science somehow began with Sir Francis Bacon and the experimental method. That this is completely untrue. This is some strange Eurocentric thing. It actually begins with, as far as the experimental method, with Ibn Al-Haytham. Okay? So experimental science was invented at least twice before, Tycho Brahe, Galileo, Francis Bacon, all of these great works that we rely on in the West. And it was invented separately during the Song Dynasty in China and in the Islamic world, in the Cairo Caliphate by Ibn Al-Haytham. Okay, so Ibn Al-Haytham was a scientist who did optics, astronomy, mathematics. He invented the scientific method. His concept of the method involved controlled testing, experimentation, skepticism, mathematical modeling, and physical insight. Those are all things we do every day here in the Aspen Center for Physics. Okay. So why did it take another 500 years for science to actually happen? What was going on in the meantime, right? 11th century all the way until really the 1600s before it truly takes off. We could say somewhere in the 1500s. Okay? Now, Ibn Al-Haytham writes, this is a short quote, so I just read it. The duty of the man who investigates the writing of scientists, if learning the truth is his goal, is to make himself an enemy of all that he reads and attack it from every side. He should also suspect himself as he performs his critical examination of it so that he may avoid falling to either prejudice or leniency. So what was humanity working on, during these 500 years? Because clearly this is what we're doing today here in Aspen. Okay, so let's talk about that. So probably the pivotal figure in the history of Islam that affected the course of the sciences is Al-Ghazali. So Al-Ghazali, he lived from 1058 to 1111. He was considered the greatest professor of his time, okay? He was a polymath. He was living in a rich ferment of societal paradigms. This involved the Islamic faith, of course, Greek philosophy, early experimental science, like I've just shown you, origins of optics, for example, Mu'tazila, which is a sort of school of thought where you could, rationally understand what was in the Quran and use your brain, something we would all think is normal today, but wasn't at the time, and Sufism, which was a form of, inner exploration or mysticism. Okay. And he had an absolute personal crisis. He reached the height of his career. You can imagine this is, Steven Pinker or Brian Greene, right? In the middle of their career, suddenly, quits, disappears, and goes to hide out in Damascus and Jerusalem in some room, telling everyone he's actually on Hajj when he's not, okay? And he hid out there for many years, and he put all of his books down, and he just thought. And at the end, he wrote this book called Incoherence of the Philosophers. So you can imagine how this book went, right? Okay, and in this book, he recognizes divisions of the philosophical sciences into 6 areas: mathematics, logic, physics, metaphysics, politics, and moral philosophy. And he says 5 out of these 6 areas good Muslims should pursue and should do. Because the problem is that people at this time were, the religious authorities were rejecting the discoveries of the scientists and the mathematicians and the philosophers because they thought they were somehow immoral. And what he says is, well, everything is good and has a place except for metaphysics, because metaphysics does involve this sort of line of questioning that is uncritical, not skeptical, and leads us to error. So it wasn't so much that it was irreligious in his view, it's that he saw it as not skeptical. Okay? Unfortunately, metaphysics involves, what they called metaphysics, we would now call cosmology, the history of the Earth, how old the Earth is, what's dark matter and dark energy, what's the nature of space and time. That was all metaphysics, right? And so the questions that became physics were excluded by him. And this led to, a real slowdown in the sciences. Okay, now he developed a famous notion of causality as immediate. And that was the idea that rather than A leading to B, leading to C, etc., as in Aristotle, for example, one of his kinds of causes, right? He had this idea that God causes everything immediately, and that everything should be experienced as a miracle. Okay? Well, this is exactly the experience of the poet. How many of you have read a poem and felt a moment when you read that poem? The fact that not everyone's hand goes up makes me a little nervous, but it's good I'm going to end with a poem. Okay. So Sufism was a very prominent idea in his time, and it was an expression of this inner world. And what he did is by, excluding this metaphysics, but including everything else, and coming up with this idea of causality as immediate, right, he was able to take Sufis who were going to be a fringe movement and be persecuted and bring them into Islam and bring that inner world into the Muslim experience. And today you still have Sufis and they still have a tremendous influence in Muslim thinking. So he made many contributions. But his main issue was how do we put together this new experimental science thing, right, which has been developing for a while but really happens with Ibn Al-Haytham, together with this very well-developed, much older inner framework. How do we put those together in a way that doesn't lead us into blind error and confusion? Okay, so he protected knowledge and he explored boundaries, is how I would summarize his career. You can still find books by him on the shelves of Muslim scholars today. So, I mean, he's really prominent. Now, the person after this, who some of you may know as Averroes. How many people have heard of Averroes? Few, yeah, okay. And I really don't know exactly when medieval scholars came up with the name Averroes. It doesn't sound anything like his actual name. His actual name is Ibn Rushd, okay? And so he lived not long after Al-Ghazali, from 1126 to 1198. He was an even more extraordinary polymath, okay? Now he lived in Western Islam, and in Western Islam, you know, there was an 800-year empire, right, in which Muslims and Christians and Jews all lived together in peace, something we would wish for today, right, in the Middle East. And maybe happens in pockets, but not everywhere. This was really successful. Unfortunately, you know, political instability led to, you know, eventually the Inquisition. I think we all know that story. But in the meantime, Ibn Rushd was able to do some really extraordinary work, okay? Now, because of this instability, his works were burned, he was banished from the court, he went through terrible persecution, but he actually persevered, and his stuff became really well known in the West. And he did the following. This is just a subset of all the books he wrote, things on logic: Aristotelian Islamic philosophy, theology, the Maliki school of Islamic jurisprudence, we still have that today, psychology, political and Andalusian classical music theory, geography, mathematics, medieval science of medicine, astronomy, physics, celestial mechanics. Can you imagine doing all of these things today? You know, Randy, could you do all of this at once?
I can't even do one of those.
The physics is already hard enough, right? We have an entire center just for the physics. So he's an extraordinary person. And you know, he wrote this book in response, right, to Al-Ghazali's book called The Incoherence of the Incoherence. Yeah? And in the book, it's a little bit unfair because, you know, there's always three statements. You know, one is like, what did the philosophers say, which is Aristotle through like Ibn Sina and Al-Farabi. And then what did Al-Ghazali say? And then he answers both of them. But of course, Al-Ghazali is dead, so he cannot respond to this, right? But it's a very nice book. It's called Tawfut al-Tawfut. And in the book, he proposes that events follow natural law created by God. He provides a defense of metaphysics. He says it does not lead us into error. We should do cosmology. We should ask about the age of the earth. We should do the sciences. And these are questions that can be addressed with this experimental method, okay? So Ibn Rushd actually leads directly to Aquinas. And in fact, in some sense, and maybe this is, you know, selling Aquinas short, but I mean, what Aquinas did is he learned Arabic really well, and he translated everything by Ibn Rushd, right, into a form that could be accepted by the Catholic Church. And by the way, Aquinas also underwent a persecution, but in the end he came out okay, just like Ibn Rushd, okay. And this is the foundation of Western secular thought. So if you want to know where we finally are sure that we're going to do the sciences, it really starts somehow with Ibn Rushd, even though there are beginnings with Ibn Al-Haytham as far as the theory behind it. Okay. With that, I want to move forward into European history. And I think a lot of you will already know this history, but I just want to remind you about a particularly important person who gave us some of the frames of reference we still use today. In fact, the kinds of pictures he made, you'll find on boards all through the hall here, okay? And he's the one who invented them. So this is, of course, René Descartes. Okay, so Descartes, you know, he lived from 1596 to 1650. He was French, but his career was centered in the Netherlands. He traveled widely. You know, he was an extraordinary polymath, again, thinking in multiple paradigms. He was a military officer. You know, he was just an amazing human being. And one of the things he did is he bridged algebra and geometry. At that time, geometry was done, you know, with like a ruler and a compass, and there really weren't equations somehow in geometry. So he bridged those, okay? And he was a philosopher, and it's not that he answered the questions, but he asked the right questions. And so a lot of philosophy has been answering the questions that Descartes posed. Okay, he was a dedicated Catholic, just like Ibn Rushd, who was a sincerely religious person, just like Al-Ghazali was a sincerely religious person. And he wanted to find a way forward, and he came up with dualism. And dualism is the following concept, that the church has its business over here, and science has its business over here, and they really don't interfere that much, and that's okay. Now, he also had some kind of nutty ideas, what we would think of as nutty now. He thought that they somehow intersected in the pineal gland, right? And that the soul and the body could influence each other. You know, there's a lot that goes into this, but essentially this is what it comes down to. And this dualism you will find all over the United States and the whole world today. It's still very persistent. Okay. So he explored a boundary we're still facing, right? Is psychology science? Is the study of, like psyche means soul, right? Is the study of the soul, of what it means to be human, is that a science or not? You'll sometimes hear physicists say, psychology is not a science, right? And then psychologists will say, what are you talking about? I got a PhD, I did experiments, I have data, you know? Right? Is human experience material? Can we quantify it, right? Can you quantify love, you know? What about the Human Brain Project? This is a billion-dollar project to study something that people would have thought was inaccessible to science in the past, right? Okay. So if you want to know exactly how he bridged algebra and geometry, he originally did in 1D and eventually it was taken to 2D, but it's exactly this idea that you have one variable that depends on another and that you can plot that, but you can also write equations for that. And that's actually beneath the understanding of like all the relationships that we use here in Aspen. So it's pretty extraordinary what he did. Okay, so let's talk about the outcome of those philosophical ideas in practical science. So I've taken us on a really short tour of some key philosophers in history that led to scientific method. And let's start with chemistry. So you may not be aware that in chemistry, in the 18th and early 19th century, they thought that organic chemistry must follow different rules from inorganic chemistry because organic chemistry was about life. Right? And life cannot be material in the same way that non-living things are material. So that is a mind-body divide, and it was in chemistry, and chemists really thought that, okay? They called this the vital force, and they were always looking for this somehow in organic chemistry. Okay, so they did some experiments to test this idea, right? So in 1816, Michel Chevreul did a conversion of an organic compound to another organic compound. So now we find out that, you know, life can be changed from one thing to another, from one living thing to another, and so, you know, that seems strange. Like you wouldn't think a person would, I don't know, become a deer, right? Or, you know, it just doesn't make sense, right? But on a small level, they found that you could do that with chemicals, and they were very surprised. Okay, and this is the case of animal fat soap being converted to glycerol and fatty acids. Now, they didn't need any vital force to explain that. So this is sort of like the ether for physicists, right? We kept looking for the ether. They were looking for this vital force. The beginning of organic chemistry is usually cited as 1828 with a famous experiment by Friedrich Wöhler in which he converted ammonium cyanate, okay, here's the chemical formula for it, right? This is completely inorganic. And he added heat basically, and he got the same compound as you find in human urine, completely organic, right? No vital force needed. Total shock. This is the end of the mind-body divide in chemistry, this experiment right here. Okay. So you see how these fundamental ideas about the sciences coming out of the humanities can then be tested, and there's this kind of interplay. Okay, today, if you like, you can get a book by Nick Lane in which you will read, tracing backward from people, yeah, all the way to stellar furnaces and everything in between. All the biochemistry, all the geochemistry. In fact, he says there's only one step that's really sort of unclear. It is the evolution of prokaryotes to eukaryotes, which is a pretty massive step in the history of life, and that one people debate about it. It seems it happened so fast, we just don't have a good record of it. We just have to guess. But pretty much everything else is filled in, right? So you start with simple chemistry in stars, and you get all the way to this discussion we're having here. And you can fill in everything in between. It's pretty amazing. As long as you trace backward, you just can't go forward. Okay. So in the process of exploring these ideas, I've been using actually some words underneath, or maybe been hearing some words underneath what I'm saying, okay? And I want to convey the importance of these words and understanding these words in the sciences. So I'm going to start with something we think is a really common word, energy. Everybody thinks about energy, right? Okay, so energy actually appears first in Aristotle, but he's talking about things like being happy, eudaimonia, okay, flourishing, things like that, right? That's a totally different idea of what we mean by energy, a very loose idea. And then we get this concept of the vital force I told you about in chemistry, right? And then in the 1850s, people started to come up with kinetic energy and potential energy and finally thermodynamics, right? And energy becomes a very concrete thing. In 2017, we say, I feel energetic, right? Or we talk about renewable energy science in the energy sector, completely standard part of society, did not even exist in any concrete form before the mid-1800s, okay? So new ideas coming out of discussions in the humanities, like what Aristotle was doing, right? They can have tremendous impact on how we do science, how we think about science, like in those chemistry experiments. Let's talk about another word coming out of psychology and philosophy. That's empathy. Do you guys know that empathy is a really new word? Empathy is a very young word, okay? So it first appears actually in German, and now there are some actual Germans in the audience who may disagree with my translation. I'm doing my best here. I had Humboldt Fellowship, they taught me German, but it never really stuck fully. I wanted to speak it well, I tried. So it was called Einfühlung, which is like feeling into or in feeling, something like this. Okay, and in German you can say a lot of subtle things like this. So in English, this American, actually psychologist, coined an English word to match this philosophical idea because he was trying to get into brain function and structure of the brain, and he was at Cornell University. He started the first big psychology department in the U.S. He had the first female PhD in psychology ever who became like the head of APA. It's a great story, and he invented this term empathy. Okay, so it's a very, very young word, right? And what do we say today? We say, I empathize with you, right? Or we say globalization, right? Globalization is understanding something about other people. It's not only making money off of other people, right? It's also connection, like Facebook, like social networks. Or interconnectedness. When I'm in a bar and people ask me about quantum mechanics, I talk about empathy, and then interconnectedness, and then entanglement, right? And that's how I take them into entanglement, because everybody understands empathy and interconnectedness. Okay. So words have power. Okay, so let's come now to U.S. situation in education. And I'm going to start with the media. Let me say the images I'm going to show you are maybe a little shocking. I don't necessarily support these ideas. I'm just pulling some things off the internet. All my sources are listed, and they're the usual sorts of sites that people surf around, okay? mommygreenest.com, there we go. Okay, so first of all, here's an important image. GMO, should we take a closer look? Why are cancer rates so high? Actually, these things have nothing to do with each other, right? But in media, you get totally different ideas stuck together, things that are scary or thought to be scary, and there's a kind of sensationalism about it. And it gets more sensational, right? Like, do you really want pesticides in the DNA of your food? Okay, pesticides don't affect DNA to my knowledge at all, okay? There's no relationship there, right? Also, by the way, we don't inject pesticides, but that's okay. So, all right, here's a famous one, right? Vaccines, apparently they create everything horrible on earth. Autism, ADHD, asthma, allergies, eczema, seizures, obesity, autoimmune diseases, and diabetes. It's vaccines, right? Okay. This is actually a conspiracy movement based on one very unethical doctor named Andrew Wakefield. If he's watching this video, he knows who he is. Okay. We have entire universities dedicated to the study of quantum mechanics, which are not actually about quantum mechanics. They're about using quantum mechanics as a metaphor. But people think this is science. So this is the media on the left, right? Now I'll show you the media on the right. Okay, this is easy. Of course it's going to involve global climate change and the conspiracy. Apparently, the Arctic ice sheet is getting bigger and we're all confused and our satellites are wrong, I don't know. So, this is the sort of thing that you find out there. Reinterpretation of, bones in the earth and how the earth must be less than 10,000 years old, okay? With words like biological molecules in the explanation, must be true, okay? Another great example is, somehow atheism is associated with evolution because of Dawkins, even though evolution is the most important theory in biology. Okay, and so you're probably saying to yourselves, well, Lincoln, that's a bunch of crazy internet stuff. You can, read about aliens on the internet too. And I don't know, maybe some of you met aliens, I don't mean to offend, but I'm just saying, it's just the internet, right? Don't take it too seriously. Okay, so is it just conspiracy theory? Okay. If yes, why is it so pervasive? If I sit down in a bar and I have a conversation about quantum physics, I'm going to get asked about GMO, amazingly enough, every single time, okay? I have to tell people, well, NIH won't do studies on them anymore because we've done all the studies. They're not harmful. It has nothing to do with GMO. It's about farming practices, really bad farming practices. Okay. So, let's look at some statistics in U.S. education. Let's see if this is just internet noise or not. Okay. 88% of Americans on average finish high school. Not bad. We would like that to be 100%. I had the suspicion it's actually a bit higher in China, but we're trying. We're getting there, okay? All right, but over half of high school science teachers don't have a degree in science. Yeah, this is true. K through 12. Okay. 73% of Americans don't ever get a 4-year university degree. This is Aspen. I presume that most people in here have a 4-year degree or have taught themselves some 4-year degree equivalent, which is fine. That works too. That's pretty serious, right? So you might say, well, is there a lack of education that's contributing to this problem? Well, 42% of Americans, this comes from a reasonable Gallup poll. I put the link there so you can look it up and see if it's crazy or not. It's not, okay? 42% of Americans believe evolution is a false theory, right? And the universe was created 10,000 years ago. This is not just internet noise. And it's not just on the right, it's not just on the left. It's all over the political spectrum. Okay. So what are scientists doing about this? How do scientists view the humanities? How does this happen the other way? I've told you about how people generally educated in the US by, unfortunately, science teachers who often don't even have science degrees, how they view the sciences. How does it happen the other way? What's the responsibility that Randy or myself, or I see my colleague Uli Shovek sitting back there, what's our responsibility? Let's see what students say. They say, science is true, literature is opinion. They say, how can you grade me down on my humanities paper when there's no right or wrong? It's not like this is a problem set. It all seems so fuzzy. These are actual quotes. Okay, how are we dealing with this? Well, before I tell you about how we try to deal with this at School of Mines specifically, I'm going to read from C.P. Snow. C.P. Snow was a physical chemist. He was also a novelist. So like me, he did more than one thing, and I think he had a lot of insight. He was at Cambridge, and here's his quote. I hope you can read it from there in yellow. A good many times I have been present at gatherings of people who, by the standards of traditional culture, meaning British upper-class culture, I think, are thought highly educated and who have, with considerable gusto, been expressing their incredulity at the illiteracy of scientists. Right? Once or twice I've been provoked and have asked the company how many of them could describe the second law of thermodynamics. The response was cold. It was also negative. He was really fun at a party, apparently. Yet I was asking something which is the scientific equivalent of, have you read a work of Shakespeare? Right? Everybody's read, this is in my abstract, everybody's read Shakespeare. I'm quoting from C.P. Snow, right? But many of us do not understand the second law of thermodynamics, okay? It's even worse. He goes on to say, I now believe that if I had asked an even simpler question, such as what do you mean by mass? Or acceleration, which is the scientific equivalent of saying, can you read? Not more than 1 in 10 of the highly educated would have felt that I was speaking the same language. So the great edifice of modern physics goes up, and the majority of the cleverest people in the Western world have about as much insight into it as their Neolithic ancestors would have had. That's an education issue, a very serious one. Okay, let's see what physicists have to say about this. And so when I quote from physicists, I'm going to start with Stephen Hawking. I respect him deeply. He's a wonderful person. He's a great science communicator, and I'm going to read some things that he has to say. Okay, we each exist for but a short time, and in that time explore but a small part of the whole universe. But humans are a curious species. We wonder. We seek answers. Living in this vast world that is by turns kind and cruel, and gazing at the immense heavens above, people have always asked a multitude of questions. How can we understand the world in which we find ourselves? How does the universe behave? What is the nature of reality? Where did all this come from? Did the universe need a creator? Most of us do not spend most of our time worrying about these questions, but almost all of us worry about them some of the time. Those of you who have children have definitely heard these questions, right? Okay. Traditionally, these are questions for philosophy, but philosophy is dead, Stephen Hawking says. Philosophy has not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly physics. Scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge. The purpose of this book, this is an introduction to one of his books, is to give the answers that are suggested by recent discoveries and theoretical advances. They lead us to a new picture of the universe and our place in it that is very different from the traditional one, and different even from the picture we might have painted just a decade or two ago. Okay, so this is what Stephen Hawking has to say. Now, as physicists, commonly, this is Aspen, so you probably know who the significant physicists are. But let's say the rest of the United States, if you ask them who's the great physicist in history, they'll probably say Einstein or Stephen Hawking, probably Einstein. For us, it's Einstein and then it's Feynman, right? And they come in the same breath, Einstein and Feynman. So this is Feynman, okay? He invented quantum electrodynamics. He's one of the great physicists in history. So he writes the following. I have a friend who's an artist and has sometimes taken a view which I don't agree with very well. He'll hold up a flower and say, look how beautiful it is. And I'll agree. Then he says, I, as an artist, can see how beautiful this is, but you, as a scientist, take this all apart and it becomes a dull thing. And I think that's kind of nutty. He goes on to say, first of all, the beauty that he sees is available to other people, and to me too, I believe, although I may not be quite as refined aesthetically as he is. This is Feynman's way of speaking. I can appreciate the beauty of a flower. At the same time, I see much more about the flower. than he sees. I could imagine the cells in there, the complicated actions inside, which also have a beauty. I mean, it's not just beauty at this dimension, at 1 centimeter, right? There's also beauty at smaller dimensions, the inner structure, also the processes. The fact that the colors in the flower evolved in order to attract insects to pollinate. It is interesting. It means that insects can see the color. It adds a question. Does this aesthetic sense also exist in the lower forms? Why is it aesthetic? All kinds of interesting questions, which the science knowledge only adds to the excitement, the mystery, and the awe of a flower. It only adds. I don't understand how it subtracts. I think Feynman speaks very well here. Okay. So, of course, Feynman was a very artistic guy. He did art exhibitions. He played his bongos famously in the middle of the night while he was working on the atomic bomb, So he's an interesting guy. I think he can understand, like C.P. Snow, different ways of thinking. So let's talk about how we can create, a person with Feynman's appreciation of the beauty of a flower and the science of a flower, right, in our educational system. Okay. This is a picture from 14th century, from medieval, I think, Bologna, yeah? And this is a classroom at that time, okay? Let's look at a picture of a modern classroom. What's the difference, actually? Does anyone know? Say it again?
More legroom.
More legroom. Well said. Okay, another difference that you notice. It looks very similar, right? I mean, more students, more legroom.
More women.
More women. That's a great one. Yes, what else?
No hats.
No hats. I think they all wore hats, but maybe not like mine. Fair enough.
Looking up instead of looking down.
Yeah. So one thing is they were looking up. Now in this classroom or this area, I am a little bit high, but in most modern classrooms, if we look forward, the students look down, and I think that's a very important change. And the other change is this piece, right? Technology. Okay. So let's talk about how we do education in physics now, right? So this is what a classroom looks like at the Colorado School of Mines. It doesn't look anything like that. It's a bunch of tables. Lectures go for at most 15 minutes. Students sit around these tables and they work out problems. They do something hands-on. They do some calculations, right? Different things are going on different screens. Okay, this is called studio physics. Okay. So in physics, we've started this field called physics education research, in which we use the tools of physics, of science, to look at our own process about how we learn. And we're very late in this game. Actually, in the humanities, people have been doing this for a long time. But we do it in our own special quantitative way, okay? And so we do things like studio teaching, like I just showed you. We also we use Socratic and partially Socratic method, in which we teach through questions and through dialogue, okay? And I use that in my own classroom. We do instructor-to-peer instruction, but we also do peer-to-instructor, where the students speak up in the classroom, and peer-to-peer, where students speak to each other. So the communication goes all ways, okay? We have a test to see how well these techniques work. It's called the Force Concept Inventory. There are many tests, but this is the most popular one and famous one. I think there are over 20,000 data points in over 300 classrooms, okay? And what we find is there is only one thing worse than the medieval and typically modern style of lecturing, of standing up and talking to people. There's only one thing worse than that. Does anyone know what it is? YouTube? Close. PowerPoint. So the scores only go down if you use PowerPoint. If you do anything else, they go up. Anything at all. So literally we're teaching in the quantifiably worst way possible other than PowerPoint. Okay. So we use things like a flipped classroom, where you see the lectures ahead of time and then you come in and you work out problems together. People need to talk to each other to learn. That's basically what it is, not just sit and be talked to. We use hands-on experiential learning, and we have a survey called the Colorado Learning Attitude Science Survey, which comes out of University of Colorado Boulder, originally I think with Carl Wyman, who got a Nobel Prize and used his Nobel Prize in physics to try to fix this thing in education. Carl Wyman's a very smart guy. He did that because this really matters, okay? And what you find out is that, generally in older styles of teaching, people not only perform worse, but also their attitude about science goes down, way down. They like it less, they're less interested in it, they think less like a scientist after coming out of the classroom. So these are very important observations. Already in 2009, I was publishing some work on doing this in the graduate classroom, and now this is really through the whole physics curriculum all over the place, lots of institutions experimenting with these ideas. Of course, this is just physics. This is a tiny slice of the pie. Let's talk about the bigger picture. So what are we doing at Mines? Okay, so this is the McBride Honors Program. So it works in the following way. We take the top 2.5% of the university based on one-on-one interviews with honors faculty like me, right? We're eventually growing this program to 20% because it's been so successful. That's a huge fraction of the university, okay? And what these students do is they have very different learning outcomes from the typical scientific learning outcomes of being able to solve a problem or understand a concept, right? To communicate effectively, to exemplify lifelong intellectual curiosity, to think and read critically in multiple contexts. Most scientists don't know that in the humanities they have much better critical thinking than we do. And if we pay attention and we read things like literary criticism, we can actually get better at doing science. And I've seen that in my students specifically, okay? Discussing ideas openly, recognizing, analyzing, and appraising differing international and cultural contexts. We also lose this in physics. We happen to get it later because of places like Aspen Center for Physics, but only if you're successful enough to get into a place like this. If you're not, you don't get that. What a loss, right? Work and learn independently and in teams, exhibit professional excellence, leadership potential, courage, and ethical reflection. Now, these are things that Al-Ghazali, Ibn Rushd, Descartes, those early chemists, they all would have said this has to happen with the sciences. They'd be surprised that's not a part of a science curriculum. Okay. Courses that I've co-taught with a poet include From the Lab to the Page, Revolutions in Science, Literature, and Society. Randy mentioned that in my introduction. Cognition, Creativity, and Catharsis, Global Paradigms and Modes of Thought. Physics, Technology, and Society from the Neolithic to Virtual Reality. Okay. And here are some outcomes. For example, here's actually a book written by Sarah Madison Brown. She learned the theory of special relativity. She read poetry on the nature of time. She did service work in India and talked to poor people about how they think about time, right? And out of that, she wrote this pretty extraordinary book. She's now actually in medical school and got in one of the top couple of medical schools in the country, and still to this day sits around reading Einstein's papers when she's on break. Okay, I always try to do what my students do because I want to show that, not only can I do it, but they can probably do it better. So here's an example actually from Heidelberg of a poem that I wrote and, a photo and including, some kind of physics mixed in, and all reflects on each other, and that's a book. Another example is an environmental engineer, Aaron Heldmeyer, who did this wonderful book, which ultimately leads to a concept of transhumanism. And he was very interested in science fiction and philosophy, and now, he works on preservation. He's probably personally going to save the wolverine from extinction, okay? So there are really great outcomes for these students. So I'm going to draw to a close here by giving you a case study, because a lot of this sounds very, amorphous, right? Or administrative or something, which is fine. Good administrators matter. But this actually affects, real science issues that could happen in a place like this, okay? And I'm showing this picture hoping that the scientists in the audience are getting really nervous and going, ugh, right? Yeah, because when we see pictures like this, we say, uh-oh, New Age woo-woo stuff, right? Lucid dreaming, colors, what's going on here, right? Okay, so the thing is, lucid dreaming is actually a well-known phenomenon in Tibetan Buddhist literature, which is the most academic of the sort of non-Western traditions historically, and it's well-known in Hindu Yoga Nidra. But, in the West, we really thought it was this woo-woo New Age stuff, okay? All right, and then, in 1981, Stephen LaBerge, who happened to be a natural lucid dreamer, got a job in Stanford Sleep Research Lab, and he had the concept that he could demonstrate scientifically lucid dreaming. And so here was his thought. Do you guys know what lucid dreaming is? It's when you're aware that you're dreaming. Like you're in a dream and you say, oh, I'm in a dream right now. And maybe that's true right now. You should ask yourselves. It's an awfully odd presentation. Maybe it is a dream, right? So the thing is, lucid dreams happen almost solely during REM sleep. And during REM sleep, all your muscles are flatlined, right, except for, breathing and stuff like that, and your eyes. So in REM sleep how your eyes move back and forth? Maybe you've seen that in movies, or you've seen that in your partner or spouse or kids. And so his idea was, well, he could talk to people in the dream, literally at their ear, and then they could answer his questions with eye signals. And this worked. And it works so well that you can actually get, reviews in, neuroscience journals that take, lucid dreaming as a given and use it to form theories of consciousness. So this is some, PET scan measurement of the regions that are active during lucid dreaming, and here's some example of EEG measurements and some sort of integrated data about what frequencies matter, and it's a serious scientific field, from woo-woo New Age stuff to reviews in neuroscience journals. Okay, and here's a quote from this particular review. The theory advanced here emphasizes data that suggest that REM sleep may constitute a protoconscious state, providing a virtual reality model of the world that is of functional use to the development and maintenance of waking consciousness. A scientist from 1975 would have said, no way, right? To something like that. Okay, so if we listen, good things can happen. And sometimes there are things to really learn, from what is apparently metaphysics, right? We better be careful when we start shutting metaphysics out, because even though much is confused, just like much is confused in science, there are things that we really need to learn, whether it's cosmology, dark matter, dark energy, where does the world come from, etc., in the time of Al-Ghazali, or lucid dreaming in our time now. So in conclusion, as I said, paradigms outside our own are valuable, right? The science we're doing today will look to scientists 500 years from now like alchemy, and we need to recognize that and be humble and be open to learning new kinds of science. There are miracles all around us, and when I say miracles, I'm talking about this poetic experience, this immediate causality that Al-Ghazali understood, okay? So let's not make science too small, but let's grow it to be bigger. So the university has a world impact. Of course, you're not all academics, but I'm an academic, and I understand that there's a responsibility. And unfortunately, the direction of the university right now, as you may be aware, is to create worker bees, And this is unfortunate. And it leads to people who have trouble with hard interdisciplinary problems, okay? So we can't hide. We need to engage in society. We need to listen. We need to learn how others think. And that's how we're going to solve problems of like clean water, right? And energy, clean energy, okay? How does this play out in practice? I gave you a small case study from my home university of the Minds Honors Program. The next quantum revolution, the big project after the Human Brain Project, right, is the Quantum Manifesto. It's also a €1 billion project, yeah? And there's a US equivalent and a Chinese equivalent. And last week, Matthias Treuer gave a very nice talk on this. I think he's not here at the moment, so if you want, you can ask him about it. You can view that talk. But, this is kind of the next step. How are we going to solve these hard problems? Okay. So with that, I'm going to close with a poem from one of my favorite poets, Mahmoud Darwish, who's a Palestinian poet. And this is the beginning of his epic poem, The Hoopoe. And when I teach my courses on creativity and cognition and catharsis to the outstanding scientists and engineers at the Colorado School of Mines, we begin the course by reading this whole poem. So I'll read you just the first piece. We have not yet come to the land of our distant star. The poem threads us through the needle's eye to weave the Abba of a new horizon. We are captives, even if our wheat grows over the fences and swallows rise from our broken chains. We are captives of what we love, what we desire, and what we are. But among us, there is a hoopoe who dictates his letters to the olive tree of exile. And our letters are returned for us to rewrite what the rain has written, wild flowers on distant rocks. An echo breaks in us and dies in order for the journey to complete itself. We were not basil returning in spring to our small windows. We were not leaves for the wind to blow us back to our shores. Here and there, a clear line marks our route of wandering. For how many years should we sacrifice our dead to the oblivion mirrored in melodious ambiguity? For how many years should our wounded live mountains of salt so that we might find the commandments? Our letter is returned to us, and here and there, a clear line marks the shadow. Thank you.
Thank you, Lincoln. Thank you for the provocative talk. But I should point out that at the Aspen Center for Physics, we do not allow PowerPoint.
For a reason, exactly.
Except on the public net.
Yes.
Do we have time for questions? Yes, in the back.
Thank you for a great talk. I wanted to,
Can you speak up, Babik?
yes, thank you for a great talk. I agree with your point, and I wanted to maybe use one of your examples and see what you think about that.
Okay.
Like, say, the state of what people think or what is going on with climate change. There is the science, and you can back up the science with evidence, whatever, but then there is the economy of whatever solution you might come up with. There's the politics of it. There's, it's a very widespread issue that involves many aspects of basically what we were talking about. And sometimes I get the feeling that, say, the scientists, friends of mine, are just, everything is settled and you should just follow this rule. And then you get a different feeling when you talk to, an economist or
Yes.
a political scientist and so on. So I think there is, this divide is showing up very much in that issue. And I wanted to see what...
So Babik, if you didn't hear him, asks about global climate change, and he points out that scientists think, well, we've already answered this question. People should just, do the right thing. And that, when you sort of talk to the non-scientists, you get a very different kind of response. And, what can we do about this? Actually, he picked up on the fact that my whale story is a metaphor for global climate change, actually. So there are only 4 kinds of people allowed in to see these whales and interact with them, right? And they were scientists who were at a loss with this terrible tragedy, right? They got some data, they did a few good things, but mostly they just sat around covered in blood and cried. You know, that's pretty much what happened, right? There were journalists who gave some kind of information. These are not novelists, these are journalists, right? They, you know, are sensational, etc. Journalists have a good role, but there's a lot more to humanities than journalism. There were the authorities telling people what to do and putting up arbitrary barriers that shut out people like Melville scholars who might have wanted to be there, right? And there was the demolition crew that came along and blew up the whales so that it wouldn't pollute the beach, you know? And that was it. And those people, in the end, felt horrified. You know, they felt like the people that worked on the atomic bomb or something. I mean, they just felt terrible, right? So when we talk about global climate change, this is something that Barry Lopez writes about all the time, and I'm basically quoting from him. But you know, there is no solution without the humanities to global climate change. It is not just a science problem. It's a human problem, right? It's a human experiential problem. It's about how we experience and interact with the world. It's about our morality. It's about our sense of who we are, right? And without the poets and the novelists and the philosophers and the musicians and the artists and the rabbis and priests and imams, you know, we cannot succeed at solving a problem like global climate change. And this is exactly why we educate these honor students who will in fact go on to be vice presidents, CEOs of resource extraction and oil companies and whatnot. That's why we educate them in these things. So like I have a Saudi Arabian friend who got a degree at Mines, and now he does, you know, mathematical modeling for how to include renewable energy into Aramco's portfolio, energy portfolio. You may not be aware, but that's a major thrust within Aramco. That's a quarter of the world's oil. That's basically the entire country of Saudi Arabia, okay? You know, and having this kind of dialogue is something that can really, really make a difference. So that's an important thing scientists don't realize. They don't realize that without the humanities, there is no global climate change solution. I'll go so far as to say that. Yeah.
Yeah, right here in the back.
Do you sometimes include in your teachings the philosophers of ancient Greece who themselves were polymaths as well? And much of our science now was anticipated by them.
So the question is, do I include the philosophy of ancient Greeks? I mean, if I didn't, I'm pretty sure they'd run me out of the university. So yes, of course I do. In fact, I still read Aristotle like over breakfast for fun. So I mean, I really like Aristotle. Physicists misunderstand him because he got a few things about physics wrong. By the way, we get things about physics wrong all the time. So he got lots of science right. He invented, you know, rhetoric and logic, binary logic, what we call now binary logic. And in particular, the Platonic dialogues are a great way to introduce students to philosophy because most famously, the symposium is a bunch of philosophers sitting around drinking and talking about love, and everybody can relate to that situation, right? So yeah, they're very important to look at. I would say a lot of the ways that we think now have their roots in that very free time, and that was a culture of creativity and innovation like ours is now, like the culture of Ibn Al-Haytham and Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd was, and that's something to learn from, so yes.
Right here.
Yes.
Well, I think we're really influenced by stories, and we listen to different stories, and we tend to think as part of a group. So our story kind of is framed by what group you're a part of and your beliefs of that group, and it's hard to break through that. In a university setting, you have a story here you're giving that's pretty coherent and seems pretty rational. But there's other stories people will have, you know, beliefs in terms of what you think or believe that the world's 10,000 years old.
Right.
Or there's climate change or there's not climate change.
Right.
And we get stuck in those things. You know, we're more open when we're younger and you're dealing with college students. But we kind of get frozen into those things. It's hard penetrate other people's stories.
Yes.
You know, and the people who have their stories, whatever they are, they're all intelligent people. And they all have their own, they say it's coherent set of beliefs. But I think we're in a situation in our society today, because of these different stories, we're kind of polarized. How do we get beyond that? You know, because they're going to go back, they're going to go to your school or other school with this type of thinking to break that through.
Right.
Through that.
So there's a few pieces. The first, but the most important, is listening, right? And that was in my conclusion. And I think Al-Ghazali shows that because he really did listen. You know, he listened to the Sufis. He listened to the rationalists of his time, the Mu'tazili. He listened to, you know, the religious authorities, and he looked for a way forward. And maybe it wasn't the best way forward in his moment, but or for us, but in his moment it made sense, right? Ibn Rushd listened to him and wrote his entire book, Incoherence of the Incoherence, is a dialogue where a person says something, or Ghazali says something, he says something, and there's a kind of a running conversation very similar to Talmud. Yeah? So I guess my answer to that is listening. And the thing I most worry about with young people, for the most part, this is an older, accomplished audience sitting here. This is not an audience of 20-year-olds. The thing I most worry about with 20-year-olds is through the media, through education, we're not teaching them to listen to each other. And you see this polarization on Facebook. In physics, we now model this in using something like the physics of people, basically social science modeling with physics methods. And you can see that how you form these echo chambers in social networks and how this platform creates this. So as far as what we can do for the young, I think the people who went through civil rights, the people who went through all the things we've gone through in this country actually know how to listen. I think the problem is that we're not teaching that to the young well. So I think the problem does lie with education, actually. Of course, I'm an educator, so I may be biased that way. As far as the role of story, I would say narrative or story is the key to who we are, actually. It's one of the prime human behaviors. So in the sciences, one thing that we try to do to simply write better papers, but also communicate, is learn narrative and learn story. And without education in the humanities, we don't do that very well. The biggest problem in Colorado School of Mines, even though these students are absolutely brilliant, go off to MIT, whatever, they don't know how to write. They write terrible essays, terrible, and even though they're brilliant, and that's because they're lacking that education. So I think this two cultures thing is, say it again? They're writing emails. Oh yeah. So I mean, I don't know if there really is an answer, but these are some of the things that come to my mind. We could talk more after if you would like to do that.
Well, you're a listener, but how do you break through to the popular society to make us better? How do we become, all of us become better listeners? Because that's hard for all of us to do, become good listeners.
One person at a time, I guess. But yeah.
I just, as a former humanities teacher in the university, and who's very educated about science as well, just sort of more on an immature secular level or whatever, what I hear, and I find myself translating, is into the Thomas Kuhn's ideas of paradigm, and that paradigm as sort of a story, way of bracketing stories makes you blind to a lot of anomalous information. What I love synthesizing what both of you guys are bringing out about what needs to change is listening. It makes us pay attention to the anomalous information, which shifts a paradigm.
Right.
And that is the only way, it seems to me. And so I think that's really great. But defining how the paradigm limits your vision is a first place to get people to listen more, maybe.
Yeah, I would say recognition of our own paradigm. That's about also cultural context. And this, young people are doing well because, like when the revolution happened in Egypt, my students had friends on Facebook in Egypt, and they were talking to them, When in my revolution course, I had the Muslim Student Society, this was at the time of the Arab Spring, come in, and each person told their story, and I had a panel of 5. And my entire class wept. These are male engineers, about 2/3 male, 1/3 female at Mines. That's the problem with STEM, right? Male engineers weeping to hear real human stories. So I think, when you talk to individuals one-on-one, then you can really listen. When all you do is read the newspaper every morning about how awful this or that leader is, I'm not sure if it really engenders listening. Yeah.
Yes, right.
When I reflect upon my journey into the life of science, it started in middle school. I had an excellent 7th grade biology teacher, and I have to wonder whether or not your ideas would be even more valuable if they were applied in a K-12 context.
Okay, so yes, go ahead.
You repeat the question.
Right, I'm going to repeat that because people were asking. So he said that this is a scientist. What's your name? I'm sorry. What is it? Dana. Okay, I think he's coming from one of the other programs. Are you from the gravitational wave or? Yeah, okay. Okay, great. Wow, wonderful. Easy problem, Okay, so Dana's saying that, his journey to the sciences began in the 7th grade in biology class, you said, right? And he wonders if these ideas wouldn't be applied much better in middle school. So one of my personal concerns is the lack of women in STEM. I happen to come from a family of really smart women. My mother has a PhD. I have 4 sisters. They're all really smart. And it really bothers me that, for example, at School of Mines, we have a Society of Women Engineers twice the size of any in the country. We're like, super advanced on women, and we're like 1/3 women. I mean, it's terrible, right? So it turns out the place where this happens, I mean, other than the, toy aisle and Target or whatever, I mean, there's a toddler element, but the main place is middle school. And so for sure, I could have just given a talk on middle school education, right? And that's the key place. to make a difference. And I think that's happening to some extent. So, for example, project-based learning, hands-on learning, a lot of these things are actually done better now. I happen to have kids in middle school, so I know. They happen to be done better in middle school than sometimes at the university. Sometimes they're ahead of us, sometimes not, it depends. But this problem with people teaching science who don't have a background in science or understand it or appreciate it, who themselves are poorly educated in science, because of our system, it's like a self-created problem. It's a vicious cycle, unfortunately. And there are many teachers who don't have a background in science and really go and learn it, but some of them unfortunately don't. They just use the textbook, right? Because they just got to get by day to day, and that's a societal problem. So that's one of the things we need to do. It's one of the things we need to fix.
Do we have time for one more question?
I think there's one here, Randy.
Right here.
Yeah.
Just a quick question.
Yes.
When you were speaking of the cause and the immediate effect and miracle,
Uh-huh.
you said it. What about today? Could you call that acausal, or as the analytical psychologist C.G. Jung would call it synchronicity? And the ancient Chinese spoke of that as well, the acausal.
Right. So the question is,
phenomenon.
I'm just going to repeat the question so everybody understands it. And let me know if I get it right. The question is about immediate cause, and Al-Ghazali's idea of causality, that things are miracles or happen through God's will in this moment. And then the mention was made of acausality in psychology and of C.G. Jung's theory of synchronicity. And that's a great book. It's really fun to look at the statistics in that book and try to use modern statistical methods on the same data. What I would say about causality is, science deals with statistical phenomena, and we're getting better and better at having small data sets, but we don't deal with unique events, actually. Right? Unique events we can't treat scientifically because we need statistics. One experiment doesn't mean much, right? You need several experiments. Yeah? Randy, yeah, okay. We can have a debate about this. So I was about to say, you have this great experiment on ultra-cold atomic matter, and there were several experiments around the time, and all of these experiments led to a certain picture. So I was going to use you as an example. Maybe you'll disagree. So when we talk about causality, there are lots of ideas about cause, for sure, and you can play with them in the sciences, and indeed we do. We have ideas of where the error of time comes from and what cause is, and we look for other kinds of cause that's sort of faster than light, things, ideas like that. One of the famous examples of where this kind of thinking has come into the sciences comes from one of my early mentors, Ray Chow at Berkeley. And so what he did is he looked at what we mean by the speed of light. And he took pulses of light and he put them through nonlinear media that reshaped them. And so when you say this chair is, let's say this eraser is here, and it's going a certain speed, so it's carrying some information from one place to another, right? I have an idea of what this object is, and it doesn't change shape, right? But if this thing was completely fluctuating, where would exactly it be? And he had pulses that would come out before they went in, by a definition of, say, where the peak was, So he would, play with cause, and he found there was only one kind of causality that remained. Energy didn't work. Energy could go faster than light. All kinds of velocities. Different sorts of velocities are faster than light, and the only thing that remained was information. So information doesn't get propagated faster than light, and that seems to be a pretty good idea for the moment. But honestly, we're still thinking about this in physics. That's a response to the cause part. It's something we seriously think about. That's the metaphysics that Al-Ghazali said we shouldn't think about, and that's a mistake for us today. It made sense for him then. I would say if we're looking at, for example, theory of synchronicity, right? This is the idea that there are acausal phenomena, morphic resonances, all that sort of thing, right? That happen simultaneously in some sense, maybe out of the collective unconscious, right? That idea is very old. It goes back to scholasticism and so-called monopsychism or panpsychism, where everything is part of one universal mind. And now we have Gaia theory, and we think Earth is an organism. It's a pretty good model for the Earth, right? So those ideas come back around in the sciences, and they come back around at a time when we can explore them and appreciate them scientifically. I think that time is coming with, non-locality and patterns and, complex networks and those sorts of ideas. Whether that's going to turn into, true acausality and something we want to explore or not, I don't know. But it's something that we really do listen to and pay attention to. And I think it's a great thing to read Jung's Synchronicity. I ought to do that in my course this semester. Thank you. I think I'll do that. Yeah.
All right. On that note, Lincoln, thank you very much for communicating so effectively.